Tandemji and Rebon, thank you for inviting me. And I must say that it was fascinating listening to Dr. Golden Chan. I have read some of your writings, and I'm normally quite skeptical about people when they talk about demise of this nation or collapse of. But I think you made a very interesting presentation. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who wanted to have an opportunity to discuss that further. My topic was chosen by Rebonji and Dr. Tandon. My fault, because I really didn't have the energy to suggest. But I did mention to Rebon that I wanted to stay away from discussing about the dialogue. First of all, I think as I look around this room, this is a room which is very familiar with this so-called the dialogue, process. And if I spend my time discussing about that, I think I will put many of you to sleep. But one thing I must say that this discussion is important, particularly even the topic itself, because people do talk about the next century being the century of Asia. And if it is century of Asia, obviously the most important player are India and China. No matter whatever may be the battle that they will, fight. I mean, you have indicated, some possibilities, or even it can go in a different direction. But whatever it is, whether it is confrontational, whether it is cooperative, there's no doubt at all. But if you look at that, unless you are absolutely ignorant or want to really fool yourself, you cannot really imagine a relation, whatever that relation may be, between these two Asian giants without the Tibet issue being resolved. So therefore, I think even though I feel intimidated in this, not only the speakers, but even the audience, but the fact that I think you invited a Tibetan to participate is very important, because this issue, you cannot really ignore that. I remember we talked about anniversaries, so this is my 30th anniversary of visit to China. Well, in fact, interestingly, our counterpart was Xi Jinping's father. Xi Jinping was our counterpart during those discussions. And while we were in Beijing for our first round of what we used to call the exploratory talks, I used to go over to visit the Indian ambassador. And even my colleagues first said that, well, maybe the Chinese will feel uncomfortable, maybe they'll feel very suspicious. I said, well, they may, but the fact is, first of all, we live in India. His Holiness lives in India. And if they have a suspicion, by us visiting or not visiting the ambassador is not going to make any difference. On the other hand, I also said that it's very important for the Indians to understand, that this is an issue that they can really not, ignore. And in those days, I think, when we first went, I think Ramesh Bandari was foreign secretary, and maybe when we went for the second time, Raja Saab, my friend who is now at the Observer Foundation, which is at Rajgotra, Ambassador Rajgotra was foreign secretary. I remember even in those days, telling them very candidly, that it is very important that India take a proactive role. Obviously, we do know that India has committed, and let's not go to the history and start blaming each other, of accepting the fact that the Tibet Autonomous Region as part of PRC, and His Holiness has also is seeking a solution within that framework On that, you see, I'm not trying to encourage the government of India to take a different approach. But within that premises, it is very important. Because in fact, I feel that when the government of India tries to pretend that it has no interest, or it is business between the Tibetans and Chinese, I think the Chinese become even more suspicious. It is always very important when India takes much more proactive, very genuine interest. At the same time, make it very clear that its intentions are not with the intention to destabilize or to harm China's interest. So that's why I think such a gathering is very important, and that we have this opportunity to discuss these matters. Now I want to discuss therefore this tragic situation that is now happening inside Tibet. This is something that I think all of us, especially hopefully, which may not the Chinese, then of course India, but the rest of the world must really pay attention. Now 100 people have self-immolated themselves. Just imagine each one of them are human beings like ourselves, who do see the preciousness of their life. Why is this happening? Almost like a prediction, during our 8th round, I told my Chinese counterparts, word by word, I said, look, I am not only worried, but I really feel almost sense of terror in my heart that unless you modify your personal policy, there'll come a time that the Tibetans cannot take it anymore. In fact, I told them very clearly that the fact that there has been many decades of stability in spite of so much of suppression is precisely because of one person. Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, is not because of the heavy military or police presence, is not the ruthless policies, it's precisely because of this one person. One, because the Tibetans had hope in him. All right, we'll suffer more. We'll take in more of the suffering because, we have, our leader speaking for us, and he will bring some, result. The other thing is that his very strong message of non-violence. But even that, I said, one day, one person can tilt the whole thing. So my worry is not only that the self-immolations, which is tragic, and I think this will also continue, but it is very, very thin, like a, razor thin. Someday it can lead into, this is my fear, different kind of act. Really, we all, I think, have sleepless nights, because if that happens, then of course we'll suffer more. Just as you discussed about Xinjiang, China's immediate reaction will be to more suppression and the rounding up, more people, imprisoning and torture. But ultimately, I think it will create immense destabilization. And if there's destabilization on the Tibetan plateau, it will not be isolated. It will have, impact in the whole region. So therefore, I think, every nation, even for their kind of, self-interest, I think must pay attention, because I'm really worried about this situation. And in fact, during the last days of our negotiations, when I was still heading it, I repeatedly try to convey to the Chinese leaders that we need to meet, not to discuss any issues, not to revisit the proposal that I gave, but to try to somehow find a way to diffuse this tragic situation that's happening on the plateau. This is of immense value. Now, we talked about leadership change, and I do not disagree. There's nothing to disagree, because I think Jayadev gave a very elaborate. But one thing I think, with regard to Tibet, now I also don't disagree that majority of them are being conservatives, quote and unquote, because again, when we come to China, when we talk about liberals and conservatives, it has a totally different meaning than what we in this room, mean when you talk about conservative or liberals. But this is just a thought, since there are so many experts here. Again, I'm not being, sometimes we Tibetans are too optimistic, but then that's also important, because if you don't have that, particularly in case of Tibet, I think we will have, lost our fight long time back, is the optimism of His Holiness and I think of our people. Now, one thing you see that the dialogue process, which of course didn't bring any tangible result, but then I think, as some of you as research scholars, diplomats will also agree that it did have tremendous also impact, because when you talk about negotiations, you must not just focus on the trips that are made to Beijing, how many trips I went and what exactly had happened at that temple, but its impact, particularly inside Tibet, what it meant for the Tibetan people. And also internationally, I think it did sustain the Tibet issue by the fact that we had this dialogue. So therefore, when you make analysis about the success of the failure, you have to look at different aspects and not just focus, because when His Holiness and those of us who served him decided to go for dialogue, we also had no illusions that by making 10 or 15 trips, this very delicate, complex, and a very ancient issue could be resolved. Because we felt that it is very important for over all aspects. Most important for the Tibetan struggle is the people themselves, especially people inside Tibet. Not so much the outside. Sometimes, I'm not very popular with some of our friends outside Tibetans, because I call them, including myself, we are armchair revolutionaries. We can make big speeches. In fact, very candidly, when the Chinese, during our discussions, started criticizing our activities, I said that you don't have to worry so much about people like me, because we live in freedom, we talk big, but your problem will be Tibet inside Tibet. The ones that you have educated, the ones that you think you have been able to brainwash. Ultimately, you have to fear the ones that are inside Tibet. That, I think, is precisely the situation. But anyway, going back, you remember that this since 2002, the formal, we had informal, discussions before that for several years. In fact, from my experience, those informal discussions that I had before 2002 were much more productive than the formal discussions that I had with them from 2002. But all that happened during Jiang Zemin's time is, I think, something to do also a little bit with his style. Jiang Zemin, as you know, is someone who gave a lot of access to, because a lot of people had access to Jiang Zemin, foreigners, business people, even within China, all kind of people. And that also gave us added advantage. So therefore we were able to, in a way, directly engage. And also the other factor is that he made foreign policy, especially Sino-American relation, as the key center of his foreign policy. And I think we have also been quite successful in making efforts to somehow make the Tibet issue very much integral part of Sino-US relation. In fact, it became almost, I'm not saying that it was the topmost issue, certainly not, but we were always there, as one of the issues, even in bilateral discussions. So he saw the Tibet issue as also making a move, maybe very slow, sometimes maybe very symbolic, but an important factor in his foreign policy, particularly in his relation with the United States. Now, Jintao was totally different. In fact, if you analyze once Hu Jintao took over, well, I made trips even during his time, but very little movement. And also, we were unable to have any access to Hu Jintao himself, because he had a different style. And this is, I think, many other, I'm sure, diplomats have also experienced. I know that Americans have expressed. He was very, very formal, and he really did not allow any, backdoor entrance, side door entrance, and that, became a major handicap. Now, looking at Xi Jinping, even in the last few months, and also, talking to people who claim they know, sometimes you'll never know, because with our Chinese friends, a lot of people come to us and say that, oh, I'm a friend, I know him well. But I think his style certainly is more reflective of Jiang Zemin's style. So in that regard, I think, because in negotiations, everything is about having the right access. Because I'll tell you, since I'm now retired, so I can tell stories. During our second round, when everything was, settled about venue and the debt, everything, then finally I get a message from, in those days, my counterpart was Wang Tako, Minister Wang, who eventually became a member of the Politburo and who just retired during the recent party congress. He sent a message to say that my number two, Mr. Kyasan Jalsen, welcome, everything's ready, but you cannot bring him. I said, why? Oh, we don't think he is very supportive of the Dalai Lama's approach. So I said, I can vouch for him. I know him more than you do. I said, why? He said, well, he went to the to some meeting in European Parliament and made a formal statement which clearly indicates that he's very hostile to China and is not very supportive. So therefore, please come, but don't bring him. So without even consulting His Holiness, the then Kaluntiwa Professor Rinpoche, I immediately answered, said that if he doesn't come, I don't come. There will be no next round. So for about 3 weeks, there was total stalemate because Wang Tako will not compromise, and I said very clearly. So finally, I was able to send this message to Jiang. Said, look, this is happening. So even on such a matter, he intervened himself by telling Wang Tako, don't make a big fuss. Let Kyasan Jalsen also come. And then again there were more. Anyway, I'm just giving an example, because when you have that kind of access, there's much more opportunity of things moving ahead. So with regard to the dialogue process, since you do wanted me to talk a little bit about dialogue process, I thought I should share that with you. However, I have just come from Dharamshala, where we had the meeting of the task force. This is a small group of us that kind of help and advise on the Dharamshala's relations with Beijing leadership. And I also said it there, and I feel that even if Xi Jinping's style and maybe approach may be slightly different from that of Hu Jintao, at least for a year and a half, I think it will be a mistake for us to see any movement on issues such as Tibet. Unfortunately for them, yes, I agree that Tibet certainly has, become more important than Taiwan at the moment. But it still does not mean that we are one of those issues that they must tackle in their mind in the next, few months, because it still is fairly, low on the issues that they have to deal with. But I think this is important that we continue to pursue that. Now, in this regard, that after I think the talks, I have asked the Foundation to share with some of you a presentation that the what do you call it? Yes, Council on Foreign Relations, some months back. The reason is because I tried to raise a few points there, which I think is also relevant. One is that especially with India, because every time, now latterly the Chinese have been very aggressive in trying to, isolate the Tibet issue. On the pretext of this one China, every time anyone tries to raise the issue of Tibet, they immediately say that, are you not committed to one China policy? How dare you raise the issue of Tibet? And unfortunately, some European countries have been intimidated. They certainly thought, yes, true, yes, we agree with. I want to point out that this one China policy has nothing to do whatsoever with Tibet. But Chinese have very successfully, in the last few decades, somehow made everyone believe. But that one China concept, as you know, came into being, specifically with regard to Taiwan. And there, you see, there's no dispute, because Kuomintang and Kuomintang both are talking about we are same. They both even say, even Kuomintang used to say that, there's only one China. Tibet's different. Tibet's, if you have to go back, you have to go back to the 17-point agreement. That is what, not the Shanghai Communique. That deals with one China policy. Tibet, even you have to go back to a position where, you accept Tibet to be part of, China. It is the 17-point agreement. That you must go back. So I hope that people will not be intimidated and somehow by the Chinese on the pretext that discussing the Tibet, issue has a relevance to this, one China, policy. The other thing, particularly here in Delhi, I wanted to bring up another issue. I hope that this will now go away, but there was very serious effort last few years of, in fact, changing fundamentally the whole approach to the issue of the so-called minorities. Doing away with the whole concept of the autonomous regions. Because somehow there are some Chinese scholars, as you remember, said that we made a mistake. We should have not even gone in that route. So therefore now we have a kind of created these separate identities for the Tibetans, for the Uyghurs, for the Mongols, that we should do away with that. In fact, we should not have any autonomous areas, regions. And some people thought that this is rhetoric by a few leftists. Certainly is not, because in fact, finally, even the executive vice minister of United Front, an official publication wrote about it. So there was definitely a move. Now, if that happens now, particularly even for India, now let's say tomorrow, just theoretically, China, does away with this so-called autonomous regions. Now, as far as I know, that India, after a lot of confusions and mistakes, but accepted Tibet to be part of an autonomous region. An autonomous region is always, of PRC. Now, tomorrow, if China violates and does not respect that autonomous status, what will be your position? Will you still say that yes? Because I think after very careful deliberations, a position was taken that you accept Tibet to be as part of PRC, but on the understanding that it is an autonomous region. And Panditji, clearly said, remember that, Zhou Enlai had assured him that China's intention is not to make Tibet into a province of China, but as an autonomous. So I wanted to, raise this. Hopefully this may, not come up, because National People's Congress did not discuss that. But you'll never know. The other factor is now, if the present situation in Tibet continues, and sadly, if it becomes even more tragic, then I think the Tibetan people will have the right to invoke, because the United Nations, has no new concept, the right to intervene. You're doing everywhere. Where it is, in your interest, the Americans, the Western nations, because this concept, became not only popular but was carried out in many countries, where even sovereign nations cannot violate the fundamental rights of its own citizens. So this is what exactly is happening in Tibet. So even the Tibet movement, ultimately, if there's no progress in dialogue, if the tragic situation continues, I know it's not going to be easy. It's not like you're talking about some other countries that China is different. Everyone treats China differently, but the principle, I don't think you can deny that. And I think the Tibetans will have to make a major move towards that initiative. So, so I thought that with this group that it may have some relevance. And with that, I think I will leave, because I think on all issues, because that's why I asked permission to be the last speaker, because then your previous speakers who are more experienced and brilliant, will say all the right things, and you just have to make little remark. But during the discussions, if there's anyone who's interested to know more or ask, of course I'll be very happy to come back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rinpoche.